Gatos Planning Commission meeting of Wednesday, September 11, 2019 is now called to order. Ms. Arnowitz, would you please call the roll?
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Badami?
Here.
Commissioner Birch?
Here.
Commissioner Tavana?
Here.
Commissioner Janoff?
Here.
Vice Chair Hansen?
Here.
And Chair Hudis?
Here.
And then for the record, Commissioner O'Donnell is absent.
I would ask everyone to stand and join Commissioner Tavana in the Pledge of Allegiance. As the Planning Commission conducts the meeting this evening on behalf of the Town Council and residents of Los Gatos, we encourage active participation, which is essential for democracy and critical to the work of the Planning Commission. That participation can occur through written comments that we receive before the meeting, or during the meeting. There are two opportunities for members of the public to participate. During verbal communications, an individual may speak on any topic that's not on the agenda. And during the hearing of a specific item, members of the public may speak about those items that are on the agenda. So if you wish to address the commission at any time, please fill out a speaker card and turn it in to staff member. And please print your name clearly. When you speak, please come to the podium and speak directly into the microphone. State your name and address for the record. And in fairness to all who want to speak at this meeting, it's requested that you limit your comments to 3 minutes. So the first thing is verbal communications, and this is for anyone who would like to speak on any item that's not on the agenda. I don't have any cards for that. Would anyone have anything that's not on the agenda? Okay, so we will now move on to the first item, which is the consent calendar, which is acted on in a single motion. And of course, any item can get pulled from the consent calendar by any member of the commission or any member of the public. The only item that we have is approval of the minutes, August 14, 2019. Do we have a motion on the consent calendar? Commissioner Badami.
I move to approve the consent calendar consisting of the minutes of August 14th, 2019.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Birch?
I'll second.
Okay. So I will now call the question. In favor? Opposed? Passes unanimously. So we'll now move on to item number 2, which is Town Code Amendment, application A19007. The project is town-wide, and the applicant is the town of Los Gatos, and it's to consider amendments to Chapter 29, which are the zoning regulations of the town code regarding demolition regulations. Ms. Armour, I understand you'll be giving a staff report.
Yes, good evening. Good evening, Chair, Vice Chair, Commissioners. The item in front of you is consideration of changes to the definition of demolition and wall as recommended by the Town Council Policy Committee and forwarded to you for your recommendation to Town Council. The recommendation from Policy Committee impacts the current definitions of demolition and the definition of wall in the following ways. For demolition, it's deleting the text, the remaining exterior walls must retain either existing interior or existing exterior wall covering, so that we would be considering the framing of the wall as constituting the wall without having to retain those exterior wall covering. It would also include revising the repair exception that was recently approved to remove reference to wall covering, since that would no longer be necessary. In addition to that, these changes included in Exhibit 4 also include changes to the definition of wall to remove any reference to the wall covering and combine the wall covering for exterior and interior walls into one definition for simplification. These changes are intended to streamline the land use process and reduce costs for remodels of existing homes. This concludes staff's presentation, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Vice Chair Hansen.
I just had one question. We had heard about this previously from several architects that there was issues with molds in the walls, and so my only question is that the policy committee's reviewed this, but do we know if other jurisdictions are using framing as a definition for the means to determine whether it's a technical demolition or not?
Each municipality does have different ways of defining demolition in terms of what the percentage is, whether it's linear feet or the area of the wall, whether roof is considered, and how they define wall. It's something that we've done a little bit of looking into, but it is not always clear what their interpretation is, just on a quick research.
And I would just add that for reference, the city of Saratoga does not include wall coverings. They've made an interpretation that they just look at the framing, just for your reference.
Okay, great. Thank you. Other questions? Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. This demolition definition refers parenthetically to non-historic structures. How would historic structures be affected or unaffected by this change in definition?
Policy Committee's recommendation specifically was not recommending changes to the historic side of this. So the requirement that the exterior wall surface be retained, that only 25% of those those sides facing the street, all of that would be maintained as is currently defined.
As I recall, some of the discussion from the architects had to do with historic structures and not knowing whether you'd have integrity of the wall until you got to the framing.
And they will still have the ability to request the repair and replace those exceptions that are currently in the code.
Okay, so repair would allow for that interpretation. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Okay. So at this point, we'll now invite comments from members of the public on item number 2. And I have one card here, but if anyone else wishes to speak, please submit a card. Gary Colsat.
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you for being here on the 9/11 anniversary. I am extremely encouraged by this movement that I'm seeing in Los Gatos to listen to the professionals and be willing to change and modify and tweak the rules. This has been one rule that personally I've gone up against many, many times and really kind of frustrated, very frustrated. I'm used to it, but none of my clients are. So I have to explain it every time. And as Mr. Paulson said, Saratoga defines a wall by the framing. I have a large project in Saratoga right now. We couldn't demo the house, but we could strip all the walls off, all the materials on both sides, which makes it much easier to do several things. And I want to just, the first time the Planning Commission looked at the demolition rules to be changed several months ago, I spoke on behalf of that, and I listed 4 examples. I'm not going to do those today, but I really want to kind of get into the logistics of how homes are built and inspected and the sequence of it. It's very important because when you're building a house, you'll frame the walls, and then you'll put your plywood on there, and you'll get an inspection. And almost every outside wall is going to have sheer plywood on that. And you get that inspected, you get it nailed off, and then you put building paper on there known as a vapor barrier. You can't do any electrical installation, anything like that, until you have your house watertight. There are some exceptions, and the building officials have to now grant exceptions if we're in the case that we're saving the interior surface of the wall in a situation where we want to remove the outside surfaces, we're leaving drywall or plaster. So now you're doing everything from the outside. You're installing wiring, plumbing, insulation, and those are all supposed to be done when you're watertight. So it really puts a bind on the contractor and his subcontractors and the building officials to be able to switch back and forth between inspecting rough inspections on your electrical, all your utilities, and then coming back for insulation inspection, and then getting your shear applied nailing on that. So it just really is awkward. But more importantly, what we're trying to do is build homes that are watertight, airtight, to a certain degree. And it's very difficult if we have to maintain these surfaces, especially an exterior surface, and not only historic homes, but homes built, we've encountered homes built in the 50s, 60s, 70s that had little or no vapor barriers. And when a contractor wants to put his warranty on this project, if I can just wrap it up, they always complain that they can't waterproof. They can't flash a window. So here they have a product that's brand new almost, remodeled, but it's not warranted. And so I just really applaud you guys, and I encourage you guys to consider what the policy committee is recommending and staff is recommending. And I speak for several architects. A lot of them couldn't come tonight, but hopefully I can carry the flag.
Okay. Thank you. Are there questions? So first of all, I wanted to thank you for engaging in this process, back at the Historic Preservation Committee and then at the Policy Committee, because I think that having the practical input from people who are actually, involved in the work is very important to getting things right. And I know it took us a couple of tries to get this finished, so we'll see where we go with it tonight. But just so that I understand, and maybe the public can understand, when something goes to technical demo, is it the case then once that happens, then the project has to comply with current codes, including things like curbs and gutters and bike lanes and things like that?
That's correct.
So that's where the expense, it triggers an expense above and beyond just doing the work if it's called to have a technical demo.
Yes, it does trigger that. Many times it will also trigger a DRC or Planning Commission approval. So there's extra steps that clients have to consider. And I don't think anybody is against undergrounding utilities and putting in sidewalks and things like that. But if you have a house that has, maybe it's an old ranch house that had wood siding on the front for curbside appeal, and for economy reasons they did stucco on the other three sides, and you just want to put siding on all four sides, so your house actually complies with the Los Gatos design standards, that all the elevations should kind of match and work with each other. You're trying to comply with what the town's proposing or supporting, but you'd have to, in order to just put siding over stucco or take the stucco off and put siding on, both would be considered demolition, by the way, if you didn't have the inside up. Many times we're remodeling the inside, stripping all the asbestos-laden drywall. You have to get all the drywall out these days. So now this client has to go, well, how badly do I want my house to look good on the side of the house if I have to pay for other expenses that were not necessarily in the budget? So yes, it certainly does complicate things to go to technical demo. And especially for reasons like this that are, I'm not really tearing any walls down. So again, show me the demo.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I don't see any other cards on this topic. Is that correct? So, okay. So we'll now close the public portion of the public hearing, and another opportunity for questions for staff. Any questions or discussion? Okay, discussion or a motion? Commissioner Badami.
I'll try a motion. It seems pretty cut and dry, and this makes sense. Appreciate the input from the architects, from staff, and the policy committee. So I move to forward a recommendation of approval to Town Council for Town Code Amendment Application A-19-007, consideration of amendments to Chapter 29, the zoning regulations of the Town Code regarding demolition regulations. I can make the findings for CEQA and the required findings for the general plan per Exhibit 1.
Okay, thank you. Vice Chair Hansen.
I second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Okay, then I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Passes unanimously, 6-0. Thank you. And we will now move, I guess there are no appeal rights, is that correct? This is a recommendation.
That's correct. This is a recommendation to council.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll now move on to item number 3. And item number 3 is architecture and site application S-19-032, project location 400 Carlton Avenue, applicant Gary Colsat, property owners T&M Properties, requesting approval of a modification to an approved architecture and site application for demolition of 2 existing medical office buildings and construction of a new medical office building on property zoned O, APN 42412-098. May I have a show of hands from commissioners who visited the property? Okay. Are there any disclosures? Okay, Mr. Mullen, I understand you'll be giving us the staff report tonight.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. Good evening. For your consideration tonight is a request to modify an approved architecture and site application. The subject property is located at the southeast corner of Carlton and Joe Drive. The site is adjacent to office, single-family, and 2-family residential uses. The requested modifications to the project approved in 2018 include reducing the size of the building by approximately 1,500 square feet and eliminating the below-grade parking garage. The applicant now proposes a 6,500 square foot 2-story medical office building with 26 at-grade parking spaces. 8 of those spaces would be located underneath the building or covered by the building in the adjacent to the ground floor lobby courtyard. The Spanish-style architecture would be continued and consistent with the previous approval, and the materials would also be consistent. The proposed project would meet required setbacks, lot coverage, and height requirements for the office zone. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission make the findings included as attachment 2 to the staff report and approve the architecture and site application subject to the conditions of approval included as Exhibit 3. This concludes staff's presentation, and we are available to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions, Mr. Mullen? Vice Chair Hansen?
I just had one question. There was a condition for the number of doctors that could be on site for it being limited to 4, and I was just curious as to how is that enforced?
We look at that carefully when the applicant comes into, or any applicant comes in to apply for a business license and a use and occupancy certificate, and we ask and work with the applicant to determine the number of parking spaces required and the number of doctors that can be there on site at any given time.
So it's done at the time that they make the application, and then once the building permit has been issued and they're operating the building, then would be someone would have to complain in the neighborhood if there was more doctors there, presumably that meaning there's more cars.
Sure. I think if a parking complaint came in, that could be one of the things we look at for what's driving a potential parking issue. Typically, as someone comes in to start operating or sharing space within an existing space, we review any approvals that we have for the use and occupancy certificate and work with the applicant to ensure that only 4, in this case, 4 doctors would be on site at any given time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? All right. We'll now give the public a portion to speak on this, and we'll start with the applicant, and then followed by Ms. Lockman, I believe. Mr. Colsat, I believe you have 10 minutes. Is that right? We're still on the 10-minute? Yeah. 5? Oh, we're on the new schedule. Okay. So okay. So So thank you, Mr. Colsett. One thing I don't know if you're aware, but there is a, time is different. It's 5
Yeah,
minutes.
I just noticed that.
Yeah, that was enacted by council recently. So,
Okay. Go.
thank you.
All right, good evening again. Most of you should recall this building when we were here in January of 2018. We presented, we had a little bit of neighborhood comments, mostly about the parking and traffic, but it was approved unanimously. And thank you very much for that. And we're here because despite my best efforts, my contractor's best efforts to do some preliminary bids on the project that ensured us that we come into budget with this underground parking structure. Lo and behold, prices have gone up, stories have changed, and it was this the cost overruns were too much to bear for my client. And so we had no choice but to eliminate the parking structure, underground structure, and redesign this with on-grade parking. And so that's what you have before you tonight. We sharpened our pencil quite a bit, and we were able to get 26 parking spaces, which equates to 6,500 square feet, one for every 250 square feet. We actually did this and maintained the existing architectural style that was desired by our client. According to the consultant, he feels that this is probably a better overall design than the first one. And so it's not every day that I get a second chance at redesigning a building, but we're proud of this one. And I think it's overall going to be a better project for the site and for the neighborhood, and most importantly for my client, because it's within its budget now. We did work with staff quite a bit after Mr. Cannon came back with his report and comments, and that's reflected in this final set that you have in front of you of the plans. This, just for a refresher, this is the existing or the original approved building, and that's what we're asking for today. So it's really not much different from the front. This is pretty subtle. This is the site plan that shows all of the neighboring properties, and the ones that are crosshatched are all 2 stories. These are renderings of the building from the rear parking lot, and this is the access way between the 2 buildings off of Carlton. This is the elevation from Joe, which has been greatly diminished as far as the impact on Joe. There's got some story poles just in case we want the pictures, but I'll just go back to that rendering. Just real quickly summarize, we have a smaller footprint that's smaller square footage. We have less occupants. We have a little bit longer length of building on Carlton, but we have a narrower width of a building from Joe. So we have parking there. The fact that we have no below-grade parking means that there's basically no excavation, no off-haul, no multiple trips with trucks. The duration of construction is going to be cut back by a minimum of 3 months. And you're going to have less noise as well. Everything is going to be much easier. It's a very tight, congested site. Now we can build this like any other regular project, and we don't have to jump through any hoops. So that should translate to happier neighbors. I say should because it doesn't always, but the owner did meet with the neighbors to talk about these changes. He met with the majority of them. The ones that he couldn't meet with, he left multiple notes and offers to meet with them. And we have a list of those as part of, I don't know if it was in the staff report or an action or a desk item, but we have that there. But I think the most important point that I want to make to everybody, including the neighbors, is that this is an owner-occupied building. This owner is going to have his eyes on the ground. he's gonna be looking over his own parking lot. He's going to be looking around at the street. He's a very active owner, even though he's not occupying the building presently. He's there often after work, on the weekends, cleaning up, answering calls, things like that. So I think that it's wonderful to have someone that's there who cares about the community.
Okay, thank you. There may be some questions, so are there questions of the applicant? I had a question. This reflects back on Vice Chair Hansen's question before about the maximum of 4 MDs.
Mhm.
What's the mechanism for managing that? Because that maximum number relates to the number of parking spaces that are
That's correct.
permitted.
That's
And if
correct.
there was another MD, then more spaces would be required, which you don't have room
Mhm.
for. Correct?
So Dr. Lardo has a great system for that, but who's present, and he can speak, but I can speak on his behalf. We talked about this. He has 2 other full-time doctors, and then he has several that are going to be part-time. One will come in Mondays and Wednesdays, one comes Tuesday, Thursday, and something like that, right? So they all know, they're all aware of what their limitations are, and a lot of them don't want to work full-time. And so it actually works out well. He is aware of what he needs to do, and he's committed to do it.
Okay, thank you. And my understanding is that the town doesn't police this ordinarily, but if there were a complaint, then they would investigate it, and
It would be a code-compliant
it
thing.
would be a code
Yeah.
compliance
Yeah.
issue, okay.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. We'll have another opportunity. I have some other questions for you, but we can hold those for a minute. So I'd now invite Ms. Juliana Lockman, I'm sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity. So I'm a brand new Los Gatos resident. I closed on my home on Joe Drive in the end of May. So this is my first meeting like this. And one of the major concerns I've had since I've moved in has been the parking. There's usually maybe 25 or plus cars on the street as it is right now, in front of all of our homes. Some of the cars tend to stay longer than business hours as well. And I know that we have up to 72 hours to have a car on the street before it gets towed. And so my understanding is that the parking right now is probably from multiple, maybe not just this building here, but the whole medical community, the businesses there. But my concern is particularly with eliminating the underground parking, that this could get worse. And another concern has been safety in terms of cars exiting the parking lot. I'm told by a neighbor that there's a pregnant woman who was hit because of poor visibility coming out of that parking lot at one point, which is a concern. Another issue with the parking lot, which is mostly, as you know, on Joe Drive existing right now, has been safety, solicitation, drug use, stuff like that that's been witnessed by my neighbors. So we're wondering if there are going to be surveillance cameras, how it's going to be monitored in terms of safety, police activity, stuff like that to keep us safe. We have a lot of families with small children who play in the yard, and that's been a major concern. In terms of the structure itself, I think it's a beautiful building. I think a lot of us would probably like to see more shrub walls or sort of barriers between the building and the resident, the actual homes. Most of the homes on Joe are small, older, 50s, 60s, single story homes, and there's an element of charm that we'd like to be able to preserve. I think those are the main things for right now.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Yes, Commissioner Birch.
A couple questions about some of the safety concerns that you brought up, just so I'm clear. You had mentioned, for example, someone had said that there was a pregnant woman that was hit. Was that at the entrance off Joe, or was that off Carlton? Do you know?
Is it off Carlton? Carlton,
Okay.
yeah.
I was first on site. Scary. And we all certainly know that area pretty well. There are a lot of medical buildings. I'm familiar with the parking because I actually have a doctor over there, and it's hard to find parking. If there was, signage or something within the space referencing safety as you leave, please slow down. Other types of visual cues that could be provided for the drivers as they enter and exit the space. Would that help a little bit on, to alleviate some of your concerns?
I think that would help a little bit, yeah.
And then one last question, if I may. You had mentioned the screening. In taking a look at this, there's the back portion has parking going up against the back.
Mm-hmm.
In reference to that, were you asking more vegetation, or were you asking for better screening from the parking to the adjacent residents?
So probably both. Yeah, so some sort of a landscaping or like a wall that sort of separates the parking from the homes nearby would be really important. Yeah, there's a big berm there right now that's kind of unlandscaped altogether, and it's a pretty large area. It would be nice to have that a little bit more, better taken care of, I think.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Oh, one other question, and I missed this because I'm new to this this project, having just moved. But so the new 26 parking spaces, what is the existing right now in terms of the parking?
So that's something that we can address with staff
Okay.
After we close in discussion, and I can assure you there's going to be some questions about that.
Okay,
So thank you.
thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry. We have another question for you, if you don't mind,
Sure.
from Commissioner Badami.
Yes. My question is somewhat further from Commissioner Kendra Birch's concerns, and that would be, have you considered contacting the Los Gatos Monte Sereno Police Department to implement a neighborhood watch program?
It's a great question. I've read that that's a possibility, and I've been interested in doing that, and kind of looked into a little bit, who would head that up. It would have to be me. I'm a busy physician as well, so yeah, I've looked into that some. I've also asked, and this might be beyond the scope of this, but if there's some way of doing permitted parking on the street for certain neighborhoods that are adjacent. So,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.
Vice Chair Hansen.
I also had a question for you.
Oh, if you don't mind, come back up. Thank you.
I know you're new to the neighborhood, so you probably wouldn't know this, but are you aware that there's also a traffic calming program that you can contact the town about? And it works by neighborhood petition, and they've done things like they'll put speed bumps in the area, or possibly another stop sign, or
Okay.
Something like that. So have you heard of this program, is my question.
What's the program called again?
It's a traffic calming program.
No, I haven't actually, so that would.
So I would recommend you contact the town about that.
Okay.
It goes through, there's a process, and you apply for it, and you bring your neighbors in on it. And
Okay. And is there any plan now for any kind of extra surveillance of the area with the new? No.
we're not really allowed to answer your
Oh,
questions
okay.
in the hearing like this,
no
but
worries.
we can talk about
Sorry
it
about
with staff when you're done. Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Other members of the public? I don't have any other cards, so Mr. Colsett, you have, I believe, another, and how many minutes does he have now? Another 5, okay. 3? Oh. 3 minutes now,
Proportion.
but we
yeah.
do have some questions. so.
Okay. So in talking to Dr. Alardo, there are 16 parking spaces, we know that, but I didn't know that there are actually 8 individual doctors that lease that office building. That equates to 2 parking spaces per doctor. So that's not meeting the ratio, right? And I don't know if that's the cause of a parking imbalance, but it could certainly contribute to that. Dr. Alardo, will have 7 to 8 staff members, so each one of them drove individually, plus you'd have a maximum of 4 doctors, so that's 12 cars taken up by staff and doctors. That leaves, if I do the math right, 14 parking spaces for their patients. So that should be adequate for their needs. And I just want to clarify that the parking across the driveway entrance into that from Joe is not part of this. It's not on our property, and it's not our parking. It's parking for the building on the corner. And the big open vacant space is also open space for that part of the, for that project, that property. It's not our property. So as much as we'd like to landscape it, I don't think that's something that we want to pay for, because it's not ours. I only have a little bit of a concern about adding any kind of landscape screening along Joe. We are close to the corner. We have to be careful. Right now, there's a hedge that actually does block some of the visibility as you exit the property on Joe. That will be removed. And so safety is our first concern when it comes to landscaping when we're talking about parking. Yes, you want to screen cars, et cetera, but you also want to make sure that drivers have a real clear line of sight. And we certainly want to make sure that people, drivers can see the sidewalks first and then the street. And if you've been out there, the striping, the stop, park, you know, the paint on the parking lot, it's all worn off. And so you're going to have a new building, you're going to have new standards that are going to be much more appropriate and helpful for traffic calming.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, Commissioner Birch.
I hear you about the screening, and obviously, safety is first and foremost. What would you guys be willing, though, to look at something along the lines of some sort of signage at the driveways, entrance and exit, about reminders, this is a neighborhood, there are kids playing, please slow down? It's not uncommon. You know, I see a lot of people do it even in, you know, public streets. But
I don't think
just
that-
as a, I mean, it's pretty inexpensive. You can buy them at Home Depot. Okay,
No objection.
great. I think,
Well, that's on Joe. They share that ingress egress on Carlton with
No.
the neighbor. So
Yeah.
it's not our property to put a sign on that.
understood. No,
Right.
I'm specifically speaking about the one that's on your property only.
Okay.
And then, I don't know what you could implement internally, and I'm not going to say like this is a condition, this is just a recommendation, just internally with the doctors and the patients, perhaps even signage inside to remind everyone that you are in a neighborhood with families. You know, be sensitive to your neighbors.
Maybe
and-
there could be a sign at the reception desk or
Exactly.
something like that.
Right, because I'm familiar with that area, and there are a lot of children out there. I think that was it, actually. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? I had a couple of questions. So trying to reconcile with the consulting architect's report, he had 5 items that were recommended, and on, I guess it's page 62 of the document. The 2 that I wanted to ask about were the separation, it says better ground floor visual separation under the structure, parking from the lobby and courtyard, and the pedestrian entries from the street. So has that been addressed?
Yes, the way we address it is, if you look at the site plan, lower floor plan, we have this walkway that there's a parking on the left, and then a handicap parking, and and then there's the office building and the stair and the elevator on the right. And so what we've done is we've introduced an arched wall with 3 arches that separates, and columns that separate the walking experience from the parking experience. And then we've also, in addition to that, I think Mr. Cano was asking for more screening with landscaping from the sidewalk and from the parking area, and we've added those as well.
Okay. That was the other question. And then with regarding the screening, and this I think gets to the question that was raised, additional landscaping if possible along the rear parking lot facade. Possibilities include trees in the interface between parking spaces and climbing vine planting. Is that something that was addressed?
It was discussed with staff, and we all agreed that there's not enough landscape area to plant trees. We could get some vines growing, not that I really want to have vines on the building. It's a great look, but it also introduces other problems, so I don't want to encourage that if I can help it. We can actually build a trellis or lattice just in front of the building to have vines climb on that. And we have a very small planting strip that we are showing some landscaping there. And there's two areas that we have a larger landscape strip, I think, to the east, and then to the western portion, we're a little bit more confined on that and constrained.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that landscaping would simply be related to the experience of the building. That landscaping doesn't address the privacy issues of the neighbors in any way, does it?
That's exactly true, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just people from the parking lot looking at the building. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the only questions I have. Commissioner Janoff?
Thank you. Related to the same item that the architect pointed out, I don't, it's just a question of clarification. The interior courtyard lobby and the under the second-story parking, how are those separated? I see what looks like a curb, but I also see what looks like an opening between the handicap parking spot and the courtyard lobby. My question is, along the line of safety, how do you ensure that the cars in the parking lot don't just accidentally wind up in the courtyard?
Well, first of all, there's a step, so that it acts as a wheel stop, okay? But then we put arches and the short walls, and so there's a visual idea that when you drive up, oh, if there's a wall, even if there's an arch, you don't drive through arches. So that's another cue to drivers not to go past that.
So just to clarify,
Within the building.
inside, separating the lobby courtyard from the parking, you've
Correct.
got arches?
We have arches.
And then there's a curb of some, a
There's a
step,
6-inch curb,
6-inch
yes,
curb.
which is normal.
Okay,
And I apologize, I don't have a rendering of the interior of that space to show you tonight, but if you can imagine, we're picking up on the 3-arch theme that we have in the front of the house, in the front of the building. I almost said house.
Is it,
It is kind of residential. Right?
and just to follow up, is the width of the openings of those interior archways, are they wide enough for a car to get through?
For a very small car, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
They're about 6 feet wide. So, I mean, a really small car. Yeah.
Okay.
But we don't feel that there's any safety concerns. And we don't use curb wheel stops except for handicap spaces. With regular spaces, they're not allowed in Los Gatos except for special circumstances. There's a very wide walkway.
I wasn't worried
Very
about,
wide walkway, and then we have the full 20 feet of depth there. So a lot of times
Yeah.
we're using a shorter amount of depth for the paving, and the nose of the car will overhang into a parking, a landscape area for an extra 1.5 feet. We're not doing that in these particular spaces. They're full depth.
yeah, if I just might clarify, my concern isn't parking per se, but it's the accidental foot on the accelerator that jumps into the lobby area. And I'm just, wondering if there's sufficient separation or barriers to prevent that from happening. And I think, these are handicap spaces, old, young, disabled, or enabled. You've seen circumstances where, a car is wound up over the curb and into Starbucks, for instance, and that's not good.
That's not good? Yeah. We don't feel that this is going to be a problem. We would rather not be required to put in a bollard at each one, just from an aesthetic point of view. I know it's a practical thing to do, but the curb will stop unless someone punches it. Yeah. So.
Yes, Commissioner Birch.
Are the columns steel or concrete? Where the the arches.
There's some steel columns in there, yeah, so some of them are structural, and the other ones are, would just be wood frame, with stucco on them. So,
They would probably stop a car.
but they're not, those arches, the two we added are not any way structural, so if someone would ram through that, they would not take down the building. They'd have to really try to knock the steel column down. It's a big steel column. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Okay, we will now close the public portion of the public hearing, and we now can take comments or questions for staff. Maybe start with that. Yes, Commissioner Birch.
What is the current occupant load of the existing building?
The number of doctors that I just want to clarify, I understand the question.
Yeah.
The applicant indicated through the owner that there's 8 doctors there. I don't have the information for the existing use and occupancy certificate or business license with me.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Chair Hansen.
Following up on Commissioner Janoff's questions, I don't know for this kind of architecture and site if our Parks and Public Works Department looks at it from a safety perspective or not. So that's my question: is anyone looking at that? Because that could, if it is potentially a safety issue, I would want to know that that's an okay configuration that we've done before. And
The Parks and Public Works Department, the engineering division definitely looks at the project and has signed off on it. I believe that they do look at it from a traffic safety standpoint. I don't have the engineer with us to confirm that, but I believe that's the case.
But you can confirm that they did do a review of the plans, and so they've signed off on it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Other questions? I did have a question about parking. We had some testimony at the previous, when we heard the application previously, from neighbors about the parking situation, and I observed at certain times very difficult parking on the street there. Some of the testimony was that people, I can't remember who stated this, maybe it was the applicant, that some of the people parking on the street were medical staff that were working across the street. A lot of people showing up in uniform and that type of thing. If this project causes additional burden on the community in terms of parking, what steps can the town take in that area? What are the possible range of things that could be done? Because it seems as though we're at a difficult situation right now.
I think I'll have the director weigh in on that as well, but I'd like to add that they'd be subject to the rules and regulations around parking in the town. The length of time a vehicle can be on the street. There are other solutions for parking. Permitting is an example that have been used in other parts of town to address different challenges, and that would be something that would be reviewed or considered by the town engineers, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
And then, thank you, Joel Paulson, Community Development Director. So typically the challenge is one of, we're talking about public streets. So we require buildings to be parked pursuant to our current requirements. There are obviously a number of office buildings in that area, medical and otherwise. And those kinds of challenges, we typically will go out when we can find out who, if there's a specific, as you said, a link to a business that may be utilizing those spaces, and we generally will send the code compliance officer out, have a conversation, see if there's some options for them to retain more of that parking on site. But there's nothing in the code or otherwise that we can ultimately tie that to. We look for folks to be good stewards, but again, we're talking about office buildings in that general area, very concentrated, and again, medical and otherwise. And I think even across the street, there may be some that aren't in the town. And so that gets to be the challenge from an enforcement perspective, but we try to do proactive outreach when we receive, and I shouldn't say proactive, reactive outreach when we receive complaints of that nature. I think was mentioned earlier, the potential for permit parking. Currently, that those applications aren't being considered because the town is going through a townwide parking study, and so those are things that could be considered in the future potentially, because that program has not gone away. But ultimately, we look to the property owners and the tenants to be good stewards and not do what they can to not impact the neighbors.
So just as a follow-up to that, with regard to permit parking, often we see that in a residential neighborhood where the residents are permitted to park and people who are not. Is there a way that we've dealt with this kind of issue where a business's employees are generating a lot of use of the public streets? Are there steps that the town can take, and particularly if we're dealing with some buildings that maybe were, constructed with much fewer parking spaces than they would require if they were under current code? Are there things that we can do?
So again, we ultimately we deal with that regularly across a wide range of businesses, and so ultimately we send the code compliance officer out to have conversations with those folks. In relation to the residential parking permits, even those allow for up to typically 2 hours during the daylight hours. It's really the overnight that's more restricted in many of our areas in town, in the residential zones. But ultimately, I think we have a very informed citizenry and business community, and our code compliance officer has no shortage of items to review, and so we try to do our best to deal with those as the best we can given our code environment, and ultimately we often bring in the town attorney's office to look for other remedies when that's necessary.
Okay, thank you. And maybe just one other question. I know the configuration of the new building is different, but is this project more or less dense than the existing?
By square footage, it is, it's been reduced. By lot coverage, it's also been reduced from approximately 31.7% to 30%.
And in terms of usage, it's the number of practicing physicians is reduced as well, is that correct?
Defaulting to the information provided by Mr. Colsat, it sounds like there would be a reduction in the number of doctors on site at any time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, are there other questions? Okay, so we will close the hearing now, and any discussion or comments of commissioners? Commissioner Badami.
I'll just make a few comments. I think the Spanish style's on point. The architectural elements, they've done a good job of minimizing the scale and mass of the building. It blends in with the neighborhood. The removal of the underground parking does not concern me. I'm actually not a fan of underground parking because it actually can invite crime because of limited visibility. So to alleviate the safety and crime concerns that were expressed by one of the speakers, that underground parking, I'm actually glad it was removed. So those are my comments for now.
Thank you. Anyone else? Motion? Commissioner Birch?
I'll make a comment, and then if it's all right with everybody, I'll venture a motion. Yeah, I also want to compliment the design. It's actually better than the last one, even though the last one was good. I like this one. And I appreciate the property owners in listening to the neighbors and their concerns. So unless anyone has anything else to say, I am going to recommend that we approve architectural and site application S-19-032, 400 Carlton Avenue, requesting demolition of 2 existing medical office buildings and the construction of a new medical office building, APN 424-12-0 098, and let's see if I can find the findings really quick. I can find the findings for CEQA. I can find the findings as required by section 29.10.09030E for demolition of existing structures, and that the proposed project is consistent with the commercial design guidelines, and that as required by section 29.20.150 of the town code for granting approval of an architectural and site application. The only thing I'm going to add in addition to that is that at the drive off Joe, that signage be placed, that drivers are cautious and consider that there are children playing in the neighborhood and to please be slow, and that in the interior of the building at the lobby, if there could be signage reminding people to please park in a parking spot and to be consider to the neighbors. You guys can figure out the wording, but that's the idea.
Okay, thank you. I have a second.
I second the motion.
Okay, Vice Chair Hansen, thank you. So further discussion? Okay, I have one comment, and then that is I'll be supporting the motion and think that the changes are appropriate and in line. However, without requiring anything else in the motion for me to support it, I would encourage the applicant to pay attention to surveillance for the neighborhood, potentially having some cameras so that the safety of that site could be upgraded from what it is now. Not a requirement, but just a suggestion. So, okay, so with that, I'll call the question. All in favor? Okay. Opposed? Passes unanimously 6-0. And thank you on that. And are there appeal rights on this?
Yes, there are. The decision of the Planning Commission is appealable within 10 days on forms available in the town clerk's office and with fees paid.
Okay, thank you. And so we are on to item number 4, which is other business, and a report from Mr. Paulson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the last council meeting, there was no planning items on that agenda, and so I don't have anything to report from that matter. However, I just wanted to inform folks that next Thursday we will be having a General Plan Advisory Committee meeting to specifically discuss potential amendments to the existing general plan regarding Highway 17. So I'd encourage anyone who's interested in that topic to come attend that meeting. And then finally, the next Planning Commission meeting will be canceled, as we were informed yesterday or today, I can't recall which, that the appellant for the item on that agenda is not available, so that will get pushed out to the next meeting.
Okay, thank you. I was curious about whether the item is coming before council that we forwarded a recommendation on the Hillside Design Guidelines. Did that already go through council, or is that coming up?
It is coming up, and we're holding up a little bit on that specific item so that Parks and Public Works can get some other items through Policy Committee and then ultimately to council, so that we don't get too far out in front of some requirements that the council may determine to be appropriate.
Okay, great. Thank you. So in addition to service on the Planning Commission, members of the commission serve on several town committees. Are there any reports tonight for any of the committees? Commissioner Janoff.
Yes, thank you. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to chair the previous GPAC meeting. And I'm pleased to report that the GPAC has finished the land use input to the consultants. So the consultants are now able to go complete their report back to GPAC, and we look forward to hearing that. And as Mr. Paulson indicated, we've got a meeting coming up next Thursday.
Great, thank you. Other committees? Okay, I don't think there was anything at Historic Preservation. So, any other matters? Okay, well, thank you. This meeting is adjourned this evening.